Okay, let's try this again. So again, today I want to think about critical race theory. I have a debate that I'm going to watch from some people that I do not know. Again, my purpose here is not to reach any definitive conclusions about any of the topics that I'm talking about. I just want to analyze the arguments. So I can pick apart a bunch of arguments from one side, and that side still may very well be right. Their arguments were just bad. And in fact, I might believe what they believe. On the other side, I might have less to say about their arguments, or I think they make overall good arguments, or some good arguments. But they can still be wrong, and I may still disagree with what they believe. So I'm really just trying to use some of what I know to analyze some arguments. So that's the gist of it. I had an audio issue before, so I had to stop and delete all that stuff, but I think I got it worked out now. Just to share my own bias real quick. First, and I think it may be helpful to define race theory. And as far as I understand it, I think the best way to understand it is that it's just an explanation for some of the things that we see in society or in the world, which is basically what theories are. It's when we have these phenomena and we want to understand why they work. So we come up with a theory. We come up with some idea about why these things occur. So when it comes to critical race theory, people thought about, why is it that there are so many minorities in prison, or so many minorities that are subject to poor education systems, have the wealth inequality, and the explanation that some people came up with, especially in law, which is mainly where it's taught, even though it's branched out from there, is critical race theory. And there are other types of theories, but that's a pretty big one. My bias is that I tend to think it's correct. I accept the explanations that it gives for why we see these social phenomena. But regardless of that, I try to remove myself from that as much as possible. I'm just interested in the arguments here. So we're going to see if any of these people have anything. We're going to see what arguments they have, and whether or not I have anything to say about their arguments, and whether or not their arguments are good or bad. So let's get started. Please work. Okay. So it may take a second. I apologize.
All right, cool. It looks like we're live. Hi, everyone. Hello, YouTube. Hope everyone is having a fantastic day. Welcome to a debate, a very random debate, actually, inspired by Twitter interactions. So we are here with some very lovely guests, and we're going to get to the bottom of critical race theory. So I hope you are in for a wild ride. For today, we have Michael Moreno, who is going to be moderating this. And yeah, that's about it. I'm going to hand this over to the professional. Go right ahead.
Well, I'm assuming that's me.
That's you. You're the professional.
Okay. Well, cool. Yeah, I believe the format was 4 minutes, correct? On the opening speeches? And then we would... Two minutes. 2 minutes each. Got you. Okay. Well, yeah. I suppose... What's the affirmative side?
Yeah, let me cut some of this out. None of this is needed. Let's see.
Race theory, but I would like it to come out in a more... or what reason has shown me to be critical race theory. Us United, an organization.
I think he's the first person to make the argument. I watched the beginning of this, so I think he's the first person to make an argument. We don't really need the introductions and stuff.
Yeah, the team with more go first.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Go ahead and do that.
Sure. And I can't promise to take about 2 minutes, but I'll try. So, I'm Christian, guys. I'm a spokesperson for Color Us United, an organization that is fighting for a race-blind society. I am also the host of the Pensive Politics podcast, which lives loudly and proudly on my YouTube channel, which is titled Christian Watson, or you can get there by typing in Pensive Politics or Christian Watson into YouTube or into Google. And I am taking a part of this debate today because I have personally seen what I believe, or what reason has shown me to be critical race theory manifest both in academic settings, public policy settings, and social settings. And I believe that, this issue, given the attention that it's been getting in both state legislatures, in the courts, in the public arenas, in the agoras of public discussion, has to be addressed in a way that is both cerebral and passionate, which is why I'm happy that we have everyone who is on this panel here with us today. And I'll just give you a brief synopsis of my take on critical race theory, but I would like it to come out in a more in-depth form later on, so I won't give you everything. I think that critical race theory is fundamentally a weak and even evil academic mechanism by which to understand. I know it seems funny, but by which to understand the world. And I will explain what that means as time persists. But that's where I'm coming from, and I'm very excited to discourse with these two fine gentlemen and with everyone else as this debate persists. So I hope all of you enjoy the show. Sit back, get some popcorn, and just keep your thinking cap on, and this will all be good. So yeah.
My name is Gothix. You all know this because you're on my channel. And I am here to debate against critical race theory because I find it to be just brainwashing disguised as something beneficial for humankind, and I do not see any benefit to it. Yeah, that's pretty much it for me. I don't really like these questions. Tell me about yourself. I was never good with that. So go for it, Dr. Carlin.
All right, my name is Carlin Borisenko. I am squarely against critical race theory. I am not remotely interested in how critical race theory manifests in an academic context. I really could care less. Everything that Sam and Aaron are going to bring to this conversation, I really don't care, because what I care about is how this stuff manifests in the real world. There is a strong difference between someone who can read an article in an academic journal and someone who actually knows how to deal with people in real life in the real world. I have watched thousands of hours of this training, either training that's been done in organizations or in classroom instruction. I basically spend my days reviewing curriculum for this stuff now. I know exactly how it's manifesting in the real world, and everything that Sam and Aaron are going to talk about, I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure it comes from very nicely worded, peer-reviewed papers where they use 18 words to say something when 3 words would do just fine. But none of that is going to have application in a real world setting. So that is the perspective that I am bringing to this debate. I have, other experience with critical race theory. I basically spend my days taking down critical race theorists. I was the one that broke the Coke Be Less White story. I'm the one who took down Kate Slater, the anti-racist trainer that was all over the news internationally. I have done many other things to make life difficult for critical race theorists. And, if this debate goes nowhere, I'm going to kind of sit back and let my colleagues of color really take the handle, because I really think that we should be decentering whiteness in this debate. We're debating against two privileged white men in this debate, and I really think that we should be centering the Black voices that are here today. So I've got my knitting man. I'm going to sit back and knit, and if I have something to interject, I'm happy to. The end.
All right.
Okay, cool. Well, I guess we can move to the other side. We can start off with Sam.
Sure. So I'm Sam Hoadley-Brill. I just finished my second year in a PhD program at the City University of New York Graduate Center. I'm a philosophy student there. I study moral, social, and political philosophy, and recently I've been getting more involved in questions having to do with race, racism, racial justice, and injustice. And that's mostly through my working with the philosopher Charles Mills, who's my professor. He's how I actually got interested in critical race theory, reading his work, which was largely responsible for introducing critical race theory into the discipline of philosophy, having been born in legal scholarship. Just based on the pattern here, I don't think I want to get all the way into my definition of critical race theory just yet, but I think that it's worth, there are at least two things worth noting about critical race theory. First, and this is you can see it in all of the pioneering scholars of critical race theory. If you read the law journals, is that critical race theory is not a theory in the sense that, the theory of evolution is a theory, or that, utilitarianism is a moral theory. It's more of an academic movement of scholars who have similar goals. Mainly, they believe that racism still exists and is still a systemic problem in the United States, and that the advances of the civil rights movement, though they have been very important, have not been sufficient to eradicate racial injustice. And so the fact that, now that the law is race neutral doesn't mean that legal institutions and laws themselves can't be racist. That's the sort of central contention of the legal scholars. And then critical race theory eventually, evolves and is taken up in disciplines like sociology, education, and philosophy.
That's time.
And cool.
Great. Okay, Aaron?
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. And I want to thank Carlin for centering identity there right at the beginning. I want to add in, I am personally half Jewish, though she's totally right that I do pass as white. And that's certainly a fun conversation to have if anybody wants to. But I'll dive right in here. I'm a progressive liberal, and my education background is analytic philosophy, especially ethics and meta-ethics. I've taught as an adjunct for about the past 10 years or so, and I'm currently working on a PhD in education with a focus in moral education. I've read a fair bit of critical race theory, especially as it applies to education as part of my coursework. And I've used some critical race theory concepts in my own writing. While CRT is not my primary philosophical approach, I do believe it makes valuable conceptual contributions. Of course, like any system of thought, CRT can and should be scrutinized, but it's important to distinguish between what I think are legitimate criticisms and a kind of moral panic that centers around conspiracy theories. So, for example, CRT is not a communist plot or CCP plot to destroy or collapse Western civilization. Unfortunately, the rhetoric around CRT, particularly CRT as applied in schools, seems to be the latest in a long line of conservative moral panics, akin to the gay agenda moral panic, the Southern Strategy, the Red Scare. The current discourse, I think, around CRT and wokeness broadly has all the markings of the conservative conspiracism that goes back to predating the Civil War and is related to the conservative panic that arose in response to the French Revolution. I'm happy to provide ample receipts on all of these claims and explain how they're different from a conspiracy theory, what the Southern Strategy is, etc. I believe that many of the critics of critical race theory are well-meaning individuals who feel legitimately aggrieved and likely aren't aware of this history. And I worry that that makes them susceptible to sliding into the sort of conspiracy-filled extremism you see with folks like Chris Rufo and James Lindsay. So I'm aware that some folks here are sympathetic to those individuals and their approaches. I believe, though, that it is possible to criticize critical race theory without abandoning liberalism or catering to dangerous conspiracism, and that we have a moral obligation to de-escalate the culture war rhetoric to avoid slipping into stochastic terrorism. So thanks very much.
Okay, great. We will go into an informal discussion period now.
Okay, so it looks like it's just these two against these three. I just want to point out, I think this is important to point out, that at this point, an argument has not really been made yet. I think maybe Dr. Carlin, it looks like is her name, has made some sort of an argument. She started to form one. I think it would be, what was she saying? She was saying, probably should have wrote it down, but I think the main idea was that
so kind of just
I can't even remember, so I'm just going to chalk everything up so far. I think it's important to recognize that really no arguments have been made yet. A lot of claims have been made, but nobody started supporting their positions yet. So I think this is where a lot of people would say, yes, arguments have been made, and you need certain components for it to be considered an argument. You need a claim, you need data, right? So Aaron was pointing out that he had receipts on everything. He hasn't given it yet, so we don't know what the arguments really are yet. And then we also need the warrant. What makes you think that your data warrants your conclusions? We also don't have that reasoning either.
Free flow. Does anyone in particular have anything they want to say in response to the sides? How you want to start it up?
Well, I think that we have.
Go ahead.
I think we have a moral obligation too. I think we have a moral obligation to the children that are being taught this ideology from the time that they're 4 years old. The Arizona Department of Education stated that students start to become children. I shouldn't even say students. Children start to become racist around the time that they're 3 years old. You're absolutely.
Oh, I remember the argument that she made now. She made the argument that, and I'm guessing this is probably going to be typical listening to her right now, that these are going to be typical for her. She had the claim that academia wasn't reality, and that reality is dealing with real people. And that is an argument, and that does not follow. So we have that issue. She's actually making she has a similar issue here where she's talking about she shouldn't even say students, she should say children, and like children can be students. I think part of it is her trying to sound a certain way when she talks, but she's making her in particular, she's making some errors here.
Absolutely right, Aaron. We do have a moral obligation to people. We have a moral obligation to raise people to not hate who they are and how they were born, which is exactly what's being taught in the schools right now. So I think we have a moral obligation to those people. I also think we have a moral obligation to the people in the workplace who are being forced to go through this training and literally say that they are racist to keep their jobs. We have a moral obligation to those people as well, not to compel their speech, not to violate the First Amendment of the United States. None of this is a conspiracy theory. It has been completely well documented. And if you would like the documentation, it is all out there on the internet.
Yeah, so we're going to have a few issues here. One, I think I just want to focus on one. She is making the claim that workers are being forced to go through this training. And this is where I feel like there's a huge divergence in definitions, but when it comes to disagreements with libertarians, this idea that you can't force someone to work. So, a libertarian may say, well, if you don't want to go through this training, just find a job where they don't have that training. I actually don't particularly agree with that, so I'm actually going to take her side a little bit here and say that I do think that realistically, in terms of occupation, people need to have a job to live, and they're also bound by certain constraints that make it's just not so practical to just go to a different job. So in some way they are compelled, they are being forced in some way to go through this training. She also seems to, I'm just going to let her continue.
Lots of it on my channel, lots of it on Chris Rufo's channel, all out there for people to see and judge for themselves what's actually going on.
Okay, Dr. Borisenko, I have a question. So you say you're not at all interested. You're not at all interested in theoretical scholarship or anything. So then how do you know that all the stuff you're talking about is a manifestation of that scholarship?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They are saying, the teachers in the classrooms are saying that it's critical race theory. There's a teacher in Beaverton, Oregon today who we have on tape saying that.
Yeah, so this is where the issues in logic really start to show through. Somebody called, this is like the old, North Korea is, in their title, they're a democracy. So therefore they must be a democracy. And this is ridiculous. So just because someone says that they're teaching critical race theory doesn't in fact mean that they're teaching critical race theory. And if you wanted to assess whether or not they were teaching critical race theory, as Sam has pointed out, you would actually need to understand the literature. You would need to understand the academic definitions of what critical race theory is, how it's manifested, in order to evaluate and say yes or no, this is not critical race theory, right? I mean, you have to have that definition before you can say she says she doesn't care, but you can't do it. Logically, you just can't do it.
that it is child abuse not to teach students critical race theory. The teachers themselves who are bringing this material into the classroom are labeling it as critical race theory. Yeah, and I have too. That's exactly what she said. So that's where it's coming from, Sam. I don't care what the literature said. The teachers identify. It is actually what she said,
I think Aaron might have some.
Yeah, so again, I have to emphasize this, okay? Like, just because somebody says that they are teaching something or that they belong to a group, that thing has to be defined. And if you're not worried about what the definition actually is, you can't say they are or not that thing because you don't know the definition. Hopefully this is pretty apparent. But people usually don't think about things like this. So already off the bat, in terms of her, I'm starting to question her ability to reason properly. She's having issues understanding how the information that she has. So it's just like teachers. So her claim is that teachers in K through 12 are teaching critical race theory. What's her data? Her data is that they say that they're teaching critical race theory. Now we want the warrant. What's the warrant? And the warrant is if a teacher says that they are teaching something, then they must be teaching that thing. And hopefully if you're reasonable out there, you can see that that's not correct. You can imagine a multitude of scenarios in which somebody says they're teaching something, but actually doesn't even understand that thing well enough to say that they're teaching it.
Context on it. Let's hear it. Aaron.
Yeah, so I listened to and I listened to some because I mean I get sent all of the things that are examples of this sort of stuff, right? People ask me, do I approve of this and that, et cetera, right? And in this particular case, what she was saying was that you should be teaching based on the principles of critical race theory, not necessarily, especially not indoctrinating, but not even necessarily explicitly teaching your children, your students, the particular principles of critical race theory. Yeah. So people, I mean, obviously we can't, people can go and look at the quote. I think this is to me sort of indicative of the kind of moral panic concern that I'm worried about with these kinds of stories, this kind of think of the children approach that presents a claim, but then when it's debunked, they've already moved on to the next claim. And I've noticed that this is a problem in several of y'all's videos. I can point to other examples if that would be helpful.
I have to get this in. I promise I'm going to shut up after this. There is a distinct difference between saying you're teaching based on the principles of critical race theory and teaching critical race theory itself. Yes, there's a complete difference between those two things. Teaching on the principles of critical race theory, completely different than teaching critical race.
Oh, I thought that she, oops. I thought she genuinely understood the difference between teaching on the principles of a certain thing and teaching that thing itself. That seems like a teacher can say that they're teaching Christian ethics by exuberating Christian ethics, being honest. That would be different from saying, hey, in Christianity, this is Christianity. Like teaching Christianity explicitly and saying I'm teaching on the principles of Christianity and that I believe in being honest and searching for truth. These would be two different things. They are. So, I mean, she can get pedantic about it, but in reality, in terms of logic, there's a difference between teaching the principles or even exuberating the principles of something and actually teaching that thing itself as a concept.
Theory itself. Christian, go ahead. Aaron, I think you should really let the black man speak. Thank you.
I agree.
Oh my. Oh, all right. So Aaron, you said something very interesting. You said that she said that she contended that she was teaching upon the principles of critical race theory. I think this is really a distinction without a difference. Let me explain my thought process to you. If I have a belief system, and my belief system has particular tenets, and those tenets have subcategories, and those tenets have subcategories, and they may have particular things that I have to reference or use if I want to manifest my belief system in a particular context. Those tenets have to come from somewhere. And the principal foundation of every ideology is where an ideology, logically, it's where an ideology's principles flow from. This is why Aristotle talked a lot about first philosophy. So if someone is teaching on the principles of critical race theory, and they are manifesting certain things that appear to be, from our vantage point, due to the content of those certain things, abusive, abrasive, or not necessarily being willing to concede to other viewpoints, because the classroom is supposed to be a context in which the individual is educated. in I think, a proper sense of education is going to demand, and this is, of course, not the education taught in Western society. We have the Prussian system, particularly in America. The proper sense of education is going to demand the cultivation of the whole individual, whereas someone who is teaching upon the tenets, or the principles, rather, of critical race theory is not necessarily doing that. They are taking a sliver of reality. They're taking a sliver of political existence. They're putting that forward. And oftentimes, a lot of these classrooms, and this is why the legislation, contrary to your contention, is being proposed, is not because of some grand, ominous moral panic, although I promise you there probably are people who are panicked, but to suggest or attribute the actions of people who are against critical race theory to moral panic is a smear that, in my opinion, does not have any bearing on the actual arguments of these people. So I suppose what I'm saying is,
I think it's important, again, to be able to tell the difference between a claim and an argument. So I think he's just conflated claims with arguments. Aaron still isn't really giving his data yet, so he hasn't made an argument. So he's not making an argument. I do agree that generally, if you want to say that Aaron is smearing, or it would be wrong, I think, to presuppose that everyone who is critical of critical race theory is basically like scared. I think they're scared of it being taught. There's sort of a moral panic about it. They may have logical arguments that they think run counter to what critical race theory is. So I'll agree in part there.
I don't think that saying she's teaching on the principles of critical race theory is any better than her teaching on the actual tenets, because the tenets must come from somewhere.
Can I say we don't even...
And again, I've already made that distinction. So you can actually work based off the principles of something and not actually be teaching that thing.
Even know what each other mean by critical race theory yet. So I think maybe we should have Aaron and then Christian define terms.
Well, you had ample time, my friend, to define in your opening, but you decided that it wouldn't be a good idea. So I mean, I began to define it, and I had 2 minutes. I mean, yes, I did. You had 2 minutes. You had plenty of time to define.
This is a freewheeling conversation. Why don't
you literally said yourself?
I'll define it.
Now, she said she was going to be quiet. She's not being quiet now. But yeah, I also don't see the issue here. Why can't they define critical race theory at any point in the conversation? Again, in terms of logic and argumentation, that's nothing to do with making a better or worse argument when you define something. Very strange.
I will define it in under 20 seconds. I will define it in under 20 seconds. Critical race theory is a fringe academic ideology that began in academia in the 1970s that says...
I mean, this isn't an argument, but factually she's incorrect.
That racism exists everywhere, in every person, in every institution, in every interaction, in every discussion, and that the job of the critical theorist is to identify how the racism occurred, not if the racism occurred, because the racism is assumed. This is the...
Okay, the in-between there was pretty, as far as I understand, critical race theory was correct in that it does posit that racism is fundamental to situations where there is a minority and a majority group, and that the majority will create certain restrictions intentionally or unintentionally on the minority group. And so that does... there is some correlation there between, the fact that racism is everywhere, as she seems to be implying. From what I said and what she said, there seems to be some relationship there. The second part is, again, incorrect, but I can't remember what she said at this point.
entire basis of systemic racism, which says that racism exists in all of our institutions, according to Ibram X. Kendi, which you guys are going to discount, but who is one of the most pop culture critical race theorists out there currently. And I know you guys are already going to discount Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi because that's the jam that you guys play. You want to reference obscure literature that no one's ever read. When
you said
everyone
yourself
out there,
that you've never read this.
Please do not interrupt a woman. When everyone out there is basing their definition on critical race theory based on Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi, that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand why this is so impressive. This kind of goes back to the David Pakman thing where he was talking to the beanie wearing guy, and the beanie wearing guy is talking about how he has this huge issue with identity politics, and then goes on to play identity politics. And I guess the purpose is to like try to beat them at their own game. Or whatever, you have this straw man that they think that white people can't make good arguments, and black people can only make good arguments, or something along those lines, and so they need to just shut up as white people. And that's not, as far as I understand it, that's not what the theory's actually positing at all.
That is what matters, not the obscure academic journal that no one has ever read.
Okay, let's have Sam and Aaron see if they take issue with that defining.
Go on, Aaron.
Sure, they will.
Well, so I mean, I do think both Kendi and DiAngelo matter. I think it's worth having conversations about them. I think they have a outsized influence on the dialogue. I will say, for example, that while I have read a bunch of things in CRT, I was never assigned either of them as part of my indoctrination program within my education PhD. We are not memorizing chapters of Kendi's book like it's the Bible or something like that. It's not part of the system in that way. I actually, think that that the criticisms of them are also generally overblown. I don't think they're perfect. I think Ezra Klein, for example, correctly said that like they're probably 60-40 in terms of useful versus not. I do think that there are a lot of misunderstandings around Kendi's claims, that Kendi, as a, I think, pretty thoroughgoing consequentialist, makes claims about the nature of actions and whether they are either X or Y based on their consequences, that reads that I think is misinterpreted as saying every action necessarily involves racism or racial intent in some way.
I must interject. My apologies, my friend. Kendi says very clearly in his book that there are no race neutral principles, and he even doubles this down. He says that
seeing an issue right here, but maybe this will change.
Policies, regardless of intention, and this is the foul distinction that many critical theorists make. They want to separate intentions from impacts, when impacts or intentions, I think, can actually really decide the motivations of a person. And the thing about the idea of systemic racism, it is a claim of intention, in my opinion, or at least properly understood, it is a claim of intention. Now, for critical race theorists, they think it's a claim of the impacts of a system that brings about inequity. But racism itself, properly understood, we can get into this later, is about intention. So Kendi says, and he says this in a certain part of the book, he says that Ronald Reagan, and I'm paraphrasing now, was anti-black because his cuts to the welfare program impacted black people. So Ronald Reagan did not have to actually hate black people, which he didn't, by the way. He didn't have to actually do anything against black people. The fact that his cuts were black adjacent must mean that Ronald.
Yes, I do just want to point out really quick that Aaron has already pointed out that like none of these texts are sacred, so they can be incorrect. Christian, if what he's saying, I haven't read the book, so I don't know, but what he's saying is technically correct. If that's exactly what was said, this would be a good example of a bad argument that the author of this book is potentially making, in that just because somebody cuts welfare programs does not mean that they did so intentionally to hurt a minority group or to specifically hurt black people. You would need more evidence than that.
Ronald Reagan is perpetuating racism. Why? And why particularly is this an instance of racism for Kendi? Because it furthers economic, in that instance, inequity between blacks and whites. So I mean, Kendi.
We're not signing on to Kendi.
I'm not saying you are, but I
Yeah.
think that Aaron did say that Kendi was being misread. No, I think that he does essentialize race to be a primary or even the only consideration of many social policies, or at least it should be the only consideration of many social policies. He clearly essentializes it, clearly in every single instance. And he clearly says race neutral does not exist. That is, in fact, racist. So you guys don't have to endorse.
Okay, so saying that race neutral does, maybe he'll make an argument here, but I'm not seeing how saying that race neutral does not exist is a racist statement.
Endorse Kendi. I don't expect you to endorse Kendi, but I do expect you to engage with Kendi honestly and say, no, he's not being misinterpreted. He is a race essentialist, and that ideology is, and you guys are both philosophy students like me.
Yeah, he seems very wrapped up in the emotions of this thing to me, because it sounded to me like Aaron was talking about very specific instances of text, and he's talking about this would be fallacious. He's talking about a different area of the text and saying, like, see, this is incorrect. So what you're saying about him being misinterpreted can't be correct. That's where you start to note the issues in reasoning here, potentially heavy ones. Because, I can say, well, the Bible is misinterpreted here, right? And then somebody can point to a different version of the Bible and say, well, no, the Bible actually says this verse. And so trying to defend the Bible, and it's just like, well, we were talking about specific verses and saying these verses were misunderstood. That doesn't mean that another verse isn't clearly understood, and defend it. Again, that doesn't follow.
Ideology is fundamentally reductive. And when you have a fundamentally reductive ideology, you cannot really engage with the substance of a claim. You can only engage with the front of it, and because the claim rejects every other quality or every other value. So I think that it's just very important just to tell everyone what Kendi or who Kendi actually is, or what he actually says in his book, because it's not pretty stuff.
You want to go ahead, Sam, or shall I?
Let's just talk about critical race theory. Like Aaron defines critical race theory.
We can do that. Yeah. Sure. Aaron.
Okay, let's define in a second. I just do want to respond to two things there. One is your claim that race is necessarily about intention. Now, to me, race is what we call an essentially racism is what we call an essentially contestable concept, right? It's a concept for which there is no one true definition, right? Nobody gets to say this is the ultimate definition of. So here's my thing, right? I think there are a range of definitions that can be functional and useful in different situations, and that it is valuable to talk about the tensions between those definitions. As a philosopher, I think you can understand concepts like fairness, for example. There is no ultimate definition of fairness. There are competing definitions of. Okay, you can disagree, but I think you can at least understand where I'm coming from as a philosopher when I say that, right?
May I respond?
Definitions are debatable, right?
Yes, may I respond?
Absolutely.
I don't think, and I don't think that I can really sum that up into a single answer. No, so I think that if you're going to engage in that Socratic action of trying to differ out and understand concepts, trying to understand how they relate to circumstances, how they relate to other principles, yes, you have to be willing to discuss a multiplicity of ideas. Yes, sure. Now, this is not the same thing as saying there is no true idea. Now, you guys may believe that. I wouldn't be surprised, but this is not the same thing as saying that. You can believe there is a true definition and still test other definitions. This is what Emerson calls testing goodness. Let me clarify. To see if it be good. Okay, please.
What I mean is there's no way for us to ultimately ever prove which definition is right. I disagree. I can give you. Well, let me say.
How can you prove like a linguistic concept? You have a mathematical proof for that?
Yeah.
A linguist.
Yeah, this is a reasoning error. Yeah, we make definitions. We define definitions. There's nothing in the external world that we can use to say, yeah, see, this thing should be defined, or this thing is in fact defined this way. Not should be. That's where we've crossed the barrier. So he's philosophically wrong here. But let's see what else he has to say.
such as what, race?
So here's what we can do.
One true definition.
I can give one definition of race, and that by that definition, certain concepts will be made clearer, certain problems will be made clearer, other ones maybe less so, right? You can give another definition that helps in different kinds of ways, and we can look at the sort of cost-benefit analysis, the pragmatic trade-offs between those kinds of definitions. Now, that was the response to your saying that there really is only one true definition of racism. And I want to be clear, I'm an objectivist. I believe there are objective moral truths that exist in the world.
You like Ayn
and
Rand?
That we can gain knowledge of them. No.
No,
Sorry.
You just believe in objective truth. Okay.
Yeah, I believe in objective moral truths. I believe in other objective truths.
I as well.
Right. Ayn Rand screwed up that word for everyone. I apologize. Right. So the other point you made about Kendi, right? Again, I think there's still just a fundamental confusion here that as an ethicist, I think, what he's saying is when you look at a policy, right? When you look at the consequences of that policy, right? It is a binary truth that those consequences either improve situations for people of color or they don't improve them, right? Those are the two kinds of options, essentially, right? And he's not saying, right, every one of them, is necessarily driven.
I also now notice I'm covering up probably the wrong area. Can I move this over? Let's see. I know I can. Yeah, that guy's not talking at all. I'm sorry.
By race or something like that. This is similar in part to sort of when you're doing an ethical calculus and you say, every action likely either causes harm or doesn't cause harm, broadly speaking, right? All actions have an element to them that is moral in nature, and we can ask questions of every action like, does it cause harm or not? And he's simply doing that with regard to the subsection of harm talking about race.
Well, do you believe in equality of outcomes or equality of opportunity?
Hold on, Carlin. I must hold on. I must respond. No. Hold on. I must respond. These gentlemen, they are very erudite, but I do think they're missing a key point here. And far be it from me, the philosophy student, to tell the grad student and the teacher what they're missing. But I think this is very important. You may be correct that the fundamental underlying ethical calculus of Kendi is that sort of dichotomous: what harm does this bring? What harm does this not bring? Now, the difference is when you have those two ideas out in reality, away from the context of race, away from any particular context, then I think that you have a little bit of a broader understanding of them. For Kendi, he appends the idea of race onto those concepts, onto the concept of harm and not harm. And he essentializes it by saying, yes, there's nothing that is neutral. There's nothing that is race neutral. There's nothing concept neutral. It's all either harm or not harm.
And so how is that essentializing? What do you mean by essentializing?
He's essentializing. He's making race the dominant factor. He's essentializing it.
That's not what essentializing is.
That's centralizing. That's different. Those are different.
He makes it central. Yeah.
No, he's not making it central. Race is the primary value judgment that he's not even primary. It is the sole value judgment that he's making.
This is really important though, because the word essentializing
yeah.
Well, so, nobody wants to be labeled a race essentialist except for like race realist or something like that, right? So it is really important that we get very clear what we mean by the word essentialize, right? I understand essentialization to be saying these individuals have a fundamentally innate and unchangeable property. Now, some individuals within the world of anti-racism do make claims, and this is actually, I think, a legitimate criticism. I'm not going to dodge this criticism. Some folks do make noises that I think do sound like essentialism, and I think that's bad, and I think we should criticize it when they do. But we want to be really careful and say not all of them, and I think not even the majority are doing that. And in fact, when you look at the history of critical race theory or the concept and its application, I think its driving goal is to push back against race essentialism, and so like that is what is central to its work. In this way.
In the form.
I want to interject.
Vanessa, right. One second. I'm sorry, I got to do this, man. In the form of essentialization against Black folks or marginalized folks. Now they tie their sort of anti-essentialization to power structures and power groups, and this is Kendi even says that scientific racism, and you seem confused, Sam. Hold on, the critical race theorists simply invert the principle of essentializing race, and they essentialize it in different ways. They essentialize it as it relates to white individuals, which is why they put so much emphasis on white supremacy, on how white folks, there are a lot of critical race theories that white folks can never not be racist because they benefit from privilege. So there is a kind of essentialism there, in my opinion. Now, we may be using different definitions of essentialism, but let me finish. Let me finish. We may be using different definitions.
I'm letting you finish.
You can essentialize a concept. You can take a broad concept and narrow it down to a single thing and say, this is what we must look at. So, for example, Kendi does this by saying that the welfare cuts against black individuals, or the welfare cuts under the Reagan administration, the austerity cuts, inherently are racist because they impacted black individuals negatively and they furthered inequity. By saying that, he omits any other explanation that could possibly satisfy or explain why Reagan cut those taxes. He omits the fact that Reagan was a Goldwater Republican, that Reagan his ears were sued by William F. Buckley, and he believed in a laissez-faire system. He didn't always live up to it, of course, but as human beings, we are imperfect entities. Concepts and values, they are spiritual things that we manifest into this world. He completely ignores every other conceptual answer except, oh, look at this, input-output. Cuts here, and inequity here, or alleged inequity here, bad. That is a simplified view of the world, and that absolutely is a conceptual sense.
Yeah, but that's a different critique from race essentialism. Like, I agree with that critique.
He's essentializing a concept.
Yeah, but not racial essentialism. He's providing a shitty definition of racism, but he's not engaging in race essentialism. That's all. But go ahead, Gothis.
Okay, sorry. Go on.
No, you're playing with words.
No, we're not. No, I'm not. I'm giving you a very concrete example from his book. I forgot what chapter it's in, but
Christian,
I can next later.
Can I talk in my own damn house, please?
My apologies.
Okay. All right. So thank you so much. I have some questions here. I wanted to circle back really quickly. Aaron, you mentioned something about conspiracy theories and how critical race theory is not something to sort of usher in communism. What evidence do you have to support that is not what it is?
Yeah, so this is, oh, great. Like, this right here is an argument from ignorance, okay? Like the person who's saying that it is he's saying that there's no proof that critical race theory is being used to usher in communism. That is different from saying that it's not being used for that at all. And so she's now, again, this is a pretty common logical error that you can go look up. So anybody who wants to claim that it is being used, the burden of proof on them is to actually prove that the burden of proof is on them to prove that critical race theory is being used to usher in communism.
Yeah, great. So I love to talk about the history of the connections between sort of attacks on civil rights movements going all the way back, like I said, to abolition and the sort of accusation of communism, actually. So, right. So what I want to say is I think that it is a conspiracy theory to claim. So it is true that most civil rights movements post 1830s, right, are influenced by Marx in the sense that people read them, they thought about him. Now, many of them are in reaction to Marx. So, for example, critical race theory is a direct reaction to critical legal studies, which was a Marxist and postmodern theory, right? The critical race theorists criticized the Marxists for the overemphasis on class and the lack of emphasis on race. So in that sense, they are in direct contrast with the Marxists. Now, as to the history of conspiracy theories, if you don't mind, I want to read a quote from, this is George Fitzhugh from his book, Cannibals All. He was one of the strongest proponents of slavery, direct antagonist to folks like Lincoln. And so here's what he says. We warn the North that every one of the leading abolitionists is agitating the Negro slavery question merely as a means to attain ulterior ends, and those ends nearer home. They know that men once fairly committed to Negro slavery agitation, once committed to the sweeping principle that man, being a moral agent, accountable to God for his actions, should not have those actions controlled and directed by the will of another, are, in effect, committed to socialism and communism, to the most ultra doctrines of Garrison, Goodell, Smith, and Andrews, to no private property, no church, no law, no government, to free love, free land, free women, and free churches. This is a quote by one of the main proponents of segregationism, right? You can find, or of slavery, excuse me, right? You can find similar quotes from Jefferson Davis on the eve of the Civil War talking about socialism, right? And so to me, the language hasn't really changed at all since then, right? You see the same things in the Southern Strategy in the 60s. I can cite more quotes from that if you'd like, but I just think it's really important to understand that, and it's also important, very important to understand that for the vast majority, for most people, when they use the word communist in regard to these conspiracy theories, they mean Jews. They very specifically, this is the part that ties in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and the
cultural Bolshevism, right? Yeah.
Right, cultural Marxism or cultural Bolshevism. And this is not to say all criticism of critical race theory is anti-Semitic. It is absolutely not. It is important, though, for people who want to criticize critical race theory to be very aware that there is a long history, including people like Hitler himself, using these kinds of anti-Marxist conspiracy theories to undermine social justice and cause harm.
You Christian, my turn. Okay, I don't think you answered my question. So I'm gonna add a follow.
Yeah, she is right about this. Yeah, so he did not answer the question. Again, it is in some way unanswerable because she shifted the burden of proof. It doesn't take any evidence to say that this is not the case in cases where there's no evidence for the thing happening. I don't have to prove that there is not a fairy in my pocket, an invisible, intangible fairy in my pocket. That's not, somebody believes that there's an invisible, intangible fairy in my pocket. They say, well, what evidence do you have that there's not an invisible, intangible fairy in my pocket? I have no burden of proof to say I just don't have any evidence for the thing. So therefore I reject the claim. So he did not take, he did not, my guess is probably he is on some level, he's either afraid of sounding pedantic by by explaining arguments here in some way, or he's having issues himself. That could be another thing too, because it sounds like he is trying to give evidence for something that he like, and it's not a good argument. It's not a good argument that well, people have used communism in the past, so therefore communism to dismiss things. So now communism, or let me rephrase that. People have used communism. Oh, yeah. People have used fear of communism to sway people away from ideas in the past. Therefore, they're doing it now. It's a pretty poor inductive argument, because communism is in fact used sometimes. So I think she's right there.
Up on top of that. So I asked, how do you know it's not a way to usher in communism? And the reason that I'm asking this is because I've had conversations with people that have gone through Marxist indoctrination and they see similarities. So what would you say to that, to someone that is saying, I've already gone through this and I'm seeing similarities in
Can I take this?
Education? Whoever.
Yeah. So when it comes to the burden of proof in an argument, usually the person who's making the positive claim is the person who needs to demonstrate evidence for that claim, right? If I claim that God exists, right, I can't just argue against you, well, what evidence do you have that God doesn't exist, right? That would be sort of intellectually dishonest. Right. So when you say, what evidence do you have that it's not a communist, Trojan horse, I feel the same way as if somebody was asking me, what evidence do you have that God doesn't exist? So I want to ask you for what your evidence is. Or, I mean, you sort of just suggested, right, is that you have interviews with people and they claim that they see similarity.
And that, yes, and now she has made an argument that we can now analyze. So she is now saying that she's met people who have been indoctrinated by communism, and they see similarities between that and CRT. Therefore, CRT is being used to usher in communism, which does not logically follow. So great. It looks like we got that one sorted out. So again, I'm having issues here. I'm seeing at least Sam. Aaron may or may not at this point. Sam seems to understand at a higher level how reasoning and argumentation works. Aaron maybe does or doesn't. The other three have all had blatant, glaring issues in terms of demonstrating that they know how reasoning works, which makes me trust them less. It makes me, if they just gave me a conclusion, hey, I think X is true, I'm going to go back to those times in my head where they didn't seem to understand how the reasoning process worked. And I'm going to double check. I'll be like, okay, well, what's your argument? Maybe they've learned it in that time, right? And so maybe they're different. But I'm certainly, in terms of an authority, I'm going to trust them less.
So I guess then I would want to know what their argument is.
If I could just piggyback on that, hold on. If I could just piggyback on that before you run and respond, Gotrix. This is very similar to me asking, well, look, Hoover was very convinced that MLK was a communist sympathizer and was part of a communist plot to bring down America. What evidence do you have that proves for sure that MLK was not, in fact, a tool of communism or socialism or something like that, right? You could present some things, I can present some things back, right? We can have an argument about it, but I do think it's important to understand for people engaged in the Red Scare, right? This was a conspiracy, a widespread conspiracy theory for which there was very little evidence and which caused a great deal of harm.
Okay, I have a really...
Yeah, he seems to understand the burden of proof a little bit there. That was a pretty good analogy, right? So it's not ever, the burden of proof is not ever on somebody saying, I'm not seeing any evidence for your position, therefore I reject the position. The evidence isn't on, the burden of proof isn't on the person rejecting the claim. It's on the person making the claim. So if you want to prove that this thing is the case, that is different from me saying, I don't believe that is the case because you haven't really given me sufficient evidence to prove it. That person adopts no burden of proof.
Really simple question. Do you believe in equality of outcomes or equality of opportunity?
Before we go...
And this right here is a false dichotomy, false dilemma. So she's now set up a situation in which it has to be either a equality of outcomes or equality of opportunity. It can't be both. It can't be that, at least if I'm understanding what exact, because there's actually two ways to answer this question, or there's probably a multitude of ways to answer this question, but the point is, if she's saying that he has to choose between the two, you can choose both. You can choose a mixture of both. But we'll see what's said here.
Go to that. That's a good question, but I want to hear the answer to Sam's question, which was what evidence the Gothics has, or Christian, or any of you who want to answer it.
This is but this is the...
Yeah, let's go back to that claim. That was a claim that was made, trying to shift the burden of proof using an argument from ignorance. What is the evidence that CRT is in fact being used to usher in communism?
The evidence. This is the evidence right here. No, this is the evidence. Okay. Do you believe in equality of outcome or equality?
That's not evidence. That's a question. That's not how evidence works. But we'll see what else she has here.
Of opportunity.
So, okay.
Did you define what you mean by each?
Equality of outcome is that we all have equal outcomes. Equality of opportunity is that we all have equal access to opportunity.
But how? Okay, but
yeah. So, for instance, to clarify this, like, I can believe that we should have equality of outcome when it comes to being able to speak freely. The outcome should be that we should all be able to speak freely as long as, like, we're not hurting somebody. We shouldn't go to jail. So the outcome would be we don't go to jail for this thing. I can believe that. And I could also believe, like, there should be an equality of opportunity. We should both have the opportunity to go out and seek a job and have some relative ability to get that job based off of our ability to do the job well. and create value for whatever organism we're going into. These two things are not opposite. You can believe parts of both. So false dichotomy.
But outcomes in what sense? Like, do we all have at least the same baseline outcome, like everyone gets to eat every day, or do we have all the exact
same? We're not getting fancy about this, Sam. The entire
I mean, it is a legitimate question. Like, are you saying like outcome in total? Because that would almost be unachievable. So that's the issue. If you're asking whether or not he believes in equality of outcome, like in totality, my guess is they would probably both say no. So they're really giving her the benefit of the doubt, saying like, I don't think you're asking this question that you think like everybody should be born on January 1st, equality of outcome, die on the same date, eat the same meals, like that. It would be very hard. It would be very hard and impractical to achieve something like that. So in what respect is she talking about equality of outcome?
Premise of Ibermex
Asking you to clarify your question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you interrupting a woman? The entire premise of Ibermex Kendi.
We're back to that again.
Women outrank Jews on the oppression hierarchy, Aaron. The entire premise of Sam, you talked for like half an hour. Don't you do this? The entire premise of Ibermex Kendi is equality of outcomes. It is in reducing disparities of outcomes based on broad racial categories. So, do you believe in equality of outcomes, or do you believe in equality of opportunity?
You just said reducing disparity of outcomes.
No, this is an either or. Yes, it is.
You can't ask me a question.
Here's the thing. I can answer this. It's not at all vague. Do you believe
it is absolutely vague?
It is not. See, I can answer this. Here's how
it's
this
a very complicated ethical question.
No. It is not a complicated. This is the difference.
Really is.
And this right here is the difference.
I can tell that you don't read any scholarship.
I don't read any of the scholarship.
Hold the condescension, sir.
In fact, I started off saying I don't read any of the scholarship, but.
I mean, yeah, it is condescension, and they could probably do without that. She's obviously been condescending. This has nothing to do with arguments, by the way, so I guess this is just my 2 cents. But she's been condescending multiple times throughout the conversation. You didn't have a problem with it. Now they're being condescending. Any other problem with it? I mean, I think they could both use without the condescension. But yeah, it has nothing to do with what I said. Has nothing to do with arguments.
But this is a very easy question to answer. Here, I'm going to answer it, Sam. I believe in equality of opportunity. I believe the American dream is about giving every person equal access to opportunities, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of their gender identity, regardless of anything else. And I believe the mission that we should be working on is reducing as much disparity as possible when it comes to equality of opportunity. What critical race theory... No, I'm not done yet.
Yeah, so I mean, I would ask her like, okay, so do you believe that everybody should not go to jail for saying anything that's on their mind, as long as they're not hurting other people, or as long as they're not, inciting violence or something, there's legal constraints around. That's another thing people have issues with. There's legal constraints around free speech. Whether or not you like that. You may not like that, but my guess is you probably just haven't thought about it hard enough. But yeah, I mean, I would ask her, like, do you think that people should have an equality of outcome when it comes to being sentenced? Let's say both people committed the same murder or whatever. Should there be an equality in the outcome of what their sentencing should be? And my guess is she would either dodge the question or she would do something along those lines.
What critical race theory preaches is equality of outcome. That is exactly how they're measuring success of critical race theory. So, which do you believe? Do you believe in equality of outcome, or do you believe in equality of opportunity? Because you can't believe in both. Choose one. You can't do both.
So, Sam, if you want to clarify, or Aaron, if you want,
no answer
without having to answer yes or no, if you want to clarify some nuance you think might be there in that question, you can go right ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious, Carlin, do you believe in the social safety net?
That is irrelevant to whether you believe in the social safety net.
Oh, I'm fully in favor of the social safety net. I'm trying to understand if you're in favor of the social safety net.
It has absolutely nothing to do with me believing in equality of opportunity. What you're talking about is outcome. I'm talking about opportunity.
Well, the social safety net is about closing gaps.
Yeah, so he's trying to get her to see that he's asking her a question in hopes that it will get her to see that this is actually a pretty complex question to answer. But I mean, he could also just get around this by saying, "I believe in both." Now let me ask you a question.
Gaps on the outcome end, not just the opportunity end.
Okay, if I may, the social safety net comes after a set of first principles have been established. Carlin's asking you a question about first principles, so you're actually kind of getting ahead, jumping the gun, kind of. So, I think that it's a little bit. No, let me finish. Let me finish.
Okay, sorry, go ahead. I thought you were done.
Enough time. No, it's fine. It's fine. It's all right. Carlin's asking about first principles, so you have to kind of imagine a reality in which that does not exist for a moment and address on the basis of first principles if you have that conviction in your heart. If she does or not, that really makes no tangible difference to your contention. Now, to the course of the conversation, it does. Oh, sure, but to her question to you, it makes no difference. So, just want to clarify that.
I apologize. I was trying to highlight a problem with the question through Socratic dialogue. My mistake. My point was, right, all of us believe in a mix of equality of opportunity and equality of outcome, in my opinion, right? No. I believe that all of us think... I believe that all of us think... Okay. I think that all of us believe that up to a point, right, not absolute, not the like ridiculous straw man equality of outcome where everyone has literally exactly the same number of pennies or something like that, right? But a more, Rawlsian kind of liberal equality of outcome where the gap is closed, where the baseline is raised for everyone up to a certain standard of living. That kind of like fairness of outcome, right, I think is something.
Yeah, like, so you could also ask her, like, if we had the resources to do it, would you make it such that every child had what they needed to thrive in terms of being fed well, being treated well, because that would be equality of outcome. The outcome is they're all getting fed, they're all being treated well. That is outcome. My guess is she would say yes.
That pretty much, I mean, I could be wrong. I didn't actually find out if any of y'all are actual liberals or conservatives or what, but like depending on what your views are, right? I think that most individuals today think that if someone has really, really bad luck, we should help them out and not let them just starve to death in the gutter. And that's what I think is valuable about concepts around fairness of outcome. I'm also in favor of increasing equality of opportunity, though I think it's impossible to achieve because of a lot of historic factors. Yeah.
I think Gothics. Were you raising your hand, Gothics, or just vibing?
Oh, I am dancing, but I did have questions. I wanted to circle back again. This is irrelevant to what you just said, by the way. Okay, so I got some more questions over here. Sam, you mentioned that critical race theory is an academic movement. And my question to that isn't a movement, like, how would you define a movement? If a movement, like BLM is a movement, as an example, I don't subscribe to BLM, so shouldn't a movement be optional? Why is it being implemented in schools if it's a movement? What
do you mean? Oh, a movement? No, it is optional in the following sense, right? If you're a law professor, you don't have to join on to critical race theory. There are law professors who have critiqued critical race theory. One most famously, probably Randall Kennedy, Harvard law professor, gave a pretty full-throated critique of critical race theory in, was it the 80s or the 90s? I think it was the 80s. Mostly he was criticizing Derek Bell. Anyways, in terms of, the way that I understand critical race theory, this is all stuff that's going on at the level of post-secondary education, because it's abstract, very theoretical sorts of work that, I mean, perhaps could be implemented into like an AP curriculum, depending on what sort of AP classes are offered. But it's not something that you're going to really see at the high school level.
Okay, so just to clarify, there's a lot of, I'm sure you guys have seen trending things of stuff popping up in schools and diversity training and things like that. Are those forms of education what you would consider critical race theory? Like, for example, I don't know, that pamphlet that was sent home to New York students about, calling out your own
Barner
whiteness.
Hess. That was it. Barner Hess's 8 different white identities.
Yeah, that is that.
So that was created by a university professor. I don't think that he identifies as a critical race theorist. I think he's closer to like the Afro-pessimism tradition. And so that is a sort of thing that is easier to market and to add into, say, like a...
Yeah, and this is definitely why you want to define things early on, they hear anything that sounds like it's saying all white people are racist, or anything to do with being critical of the actions of white people in regard to how they may affect other minorities, and they say, oh, that's critical race theory, not understanding, as I said at the beginning of all this, that there are a bunch of different ideas out there that all are saying different things.
A diversity training or seminar than the sort of stuff you find in critical race theory, which is more focused on institutional analysis and specific, when it comes to law, you're looking at specific court cases and all this stuff that really probably wouldn't be relevant to a diversity seminar. But I do think that there is some stuff there are ways that critical race scholarship, whether it's in law or in sociology or education, or even some philosophical concepts, can influence diversity training. Sure, there can be diversity trainers who decide to sort of co-opt or implement those ideas, but nothing in critical race theory suggests that diversity trainings are going to be like the method to sort of solving racial inequality or anything like that.
Okay, really quick question. So do you have an example of critical race theory being implemented right now if the thing from New York, for example, doesn't classify that? Like, what can I go off of to say this is critical race theory?
Yeah, I could jump in on this since I have more of the education background. And I will say, I think Sam and my experiences of this have been different because I have, read how this stuff is applied in education literature. And I do think it is being applied, though, as I said, not necessarily taught in various K through 12 schools, though I imagine it is probably, proportional to the political, leanings of the school board or the school community or something like that, right? But certainly in New York, you can probably find teachers teaching from critical race theory based ideas. Now, some examples that I want to put forward that I think are valuable that I've come across in my education would be one major, when we talk about the broader umbrella of critical race theory in education, one major example would be the shift away from what's called the deficit model of education towards the asset model of education. So the deficit model is the sort of traditional model that says this student has X problem and we need to fix it with our education method or something like that, and has traditionally resulted in marginalized students being viewed as problem students, as being defective, as having bad cultural background that makes them unable to do their work or something like that. And there's plenty of discussion about that in the literature. And then the shift from that is towards this idea of an asset model that says, we need to look at these marginalized communities and say, what assets do they have? What have they cultivated, especially as members of a marginalized community? Things like non-dominant cultural capital that we as educators can help them draw on to improve their outcomes, right? To improve their understandings and things like that. So I think those are, and I understand there are bad versions of everything out there.
Do you have like examples? Like an example?
What do you mean like?
Like, for example, the whiteness chart, I would say that this is an assignment. Here you go, kid.
Yeah, so, that was an example. I see what she's saying, though. She's really looking for an instance is probably what she would want to use, the word that she would want to use. But the shift from the deficit model to the asset model is an example. That shift is an example. She's probably looking for like an instance. And she's can't tell if she's looking for an instance in K through 12 or just an instance in general.
Do you have like an example?
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So
I could think of one. Oh, go ahead.
Well, one example I think that people have talked about some, and I know is cringe to some people, but I think is valuable to others, would be like privilege walks, right? Where you have your students line up and you go through a list of what we would call different kinds of privileges, or I would call them kinds of moral luck, right? And students take steps forward as they identify with a particular kind of privilege, and this gives them a sense of sort of relative privilege. And I think that this can be sort of a valuable just lecturing from the front of the classroom approach to conveying these issues of different of inequalities of opportunity, right? To use Carlin's favorite term here.
Not my favorite term. My favorite term my favorite question at the moment, though, is like, have either of you two ever worked outside of academia? Do either of you two have any practical experience with how these things are applied in the real world? Because we're talking a lot about theory and research and literature and all these things, but how much time?
Quality ad hominem, though. Go for it. Yeah, all the way in.
I got to circle back.
I'm not a professional debater.
I can't.
Yeah, that might not be an ad hominem. He used ad hominem, I think, incorrectly there, because she wasn't saying that we should disregard what he's saying or that his argument is false because of the incorrect idea that he hasn't worked outside of academia. That was just an insult.
I get that
I just have a question. Now, I will admit my ignorance. I've not studied the depths of educational theory as Aaron has. So I'm engaging. I'm entering this
I'm not an
space and
expert.
engaging.
I just
that's okay.
We
you
know.
don't have to well, Carlin, you don't have to preface it with you're not an expert, dude. The statements that you're saying are out in the world right now, so we're going to analyze them.
I know. I just wanted to be clear.
Do you find it troublesome? Do you find it troublesome that there is an educational theory that is overly prescriptive and about a certain ideology and its impacts in the real world without ceding ground to the potential of that ideology being incorrect? Because one of the educational systems you just described teaches marginalized kids or whatever. How they can interact with the world or whatever. Don't you think that's a little bit narrow? Because education, as traditionally understood, now, of course, we've deviated from this, we can have a separate conversation if you want to, is about making the man, making it a holistic individual. I don't think, to me, that seems, and I say traditionally, let me be more specific, as the ancient Greeks thought. There are different education systems and models, of course, across the world. Let me just be very honest.
Du Bois, too. Right? You could, if you wanted to cite a relevant source here, right?
So my question is, don't you think that, classical education, the idea of classical education is about making the man holistic. I mean, you guys are philosophy people, you should know that. But
right, I'm just saying Du Bois picks up the same idea from Aristotle, so it's part of critical race theory. I'm
not an extoller of Aristotle. I'm just saying. This just seems very narrow to me. And of course, Du Bois, W.D. Du Bois, right? He had in the Soul of Black Folk, which I believe he wrote. In the Soul of Black Folk, he very much talks about how African Americans have a united political destiny, and they've got to do a particular political thing in order to be free from. And Washington said, no. You stay with yourself. You stay in your community. Cultivate the self. Cultivate who you are, and you'll be okay. Now, of course, we can debate the legitimacy of those ideas later, but I think that anyway. My point is this: don't you think it's a very narrow idea to have an educational model that appends itself to a particular answer, a particular ideology, and does not consider the gains, the benefits, or even that their own ideology could be entirely wrong? I think that if you're going to be epistemically humble, that's the way to go. Maybe I'm mistaken, but you tell me.
I think this is going to be one of my last comments, but I would say that again, those things aren't mutually exclusive. So you can have a system that is focused on a particular ideology or is focused on particular principles, but is still open to the fact that they could be wrong and open to change. It's not about having one or the other. Like, I think that one of the purposes of education should be to help students explore what's true. And as far as I know, that should not be compromised, unless now that can be revised. But that doesn't mean I don't think it shouldn't be focused on that. But I think I'm going to just hear a little bit more of this, and then I'm done with this.
I actually agree with you here, and I think it is a legitimate concern to raise against some of the practitioners of critical race theory as applied in the world, that they are overconfident, that they overextend their theories, that they go, they take things too far. It's an unfortunate fact of all ideologies that they can be overextended that way. It is a worse problem for ideologies that have moral claims, and as a moralizing theory, right, critical race theory is at risk, and I've written about this before, at risk of slipping into religious-like behavior, though I do not believe it to actually be a religion. So I am sympathetic to your concern, and I will even go so far as to draw the curtain back and say I have experienced a little bit of people being like that in my education department, where they were a little defensive about these kinds of theories.
Wait, I have a question. I have a question related directly.
One last question.
Hang on, Christian. I have to ask this question, and this is a serious question. This is a serious question. If you are concerned about the way the critical race theory is being applied in the real world, if you think it's overextended, if you think they're not applying it accurately, then why aren't you speaking out against it? Why aren't you speaking out against all the misapplication? Why aren't you speaking out against Robin DiAngelo being the #1 best-selling book in America if it's completely not what your theory says at all? Why aren't you being more vocal about it?
I have.
Yeah. This is, again, demonstrating poor reasoning. I don't think that she's not understanding the limits of her own knowledge. My guess is that she hasn't read everything that they've written on social media or in potential books that they've written or said on YouTube to know that they haven't been critical or outspoken about these things. So it demonstrates an inability to understand her own ignorance, which we all have. Not like she's more ignorant or whatever. It's that part of being a critically thinking person is understanding what you can and cannot know because of the limited exposure you have to data and information.
So you can join me, Sam.
Let's hear their answer to the question, Carol.
Right. The second half of my comment was going to be, I also, on the other hand, think that overall that is not, that like while there is a reasonable concern there, that the reality is educators are not exclusively teaching based on critical race theory. It is not the single ideology that they are all being indoctrinated into. There are sort of a range of theories that compete with critical race theory that are also
Yeah, I got my master's. I teach English, and I knew very little about critical race theory. I don't even think I heard the term. If I did, it was very little when I was getting my education. So same thing with intersectionality. Those are things that I learned a lot of. I got my minor in sociology, so I think maybe I heard a little bit about intersectionality there. But this idea that teachers are being indoctrinated into this, and then to say that you don't read anything seems very ignorant to me. Or you don't read anything on this topic.
applied in educational settings. I think that's just a basic reality. And so I do think there is a more well-rounded approach than the emphasis on critical race theory suggests. That's all I want to say about.
Hi, I have a question. Okay, I want to go back to you, Aaron, because you gave me like an example. I think you called it like a privilege line or something like that. Like everyone lines up
privilege
and
they
a privilege
walk or something like that. Okay. So I acknowledge that there is privilege. Everyone has their own different privilege, varying degrees. I don't believe specifically in privilege based on skin color. But you asked me, I think Sam asked me, what evidence do I have about critical race theory, having some signs of something used to usher in communism. One of the conversations that I had with someone that grew up during the Cultural Revolution, she said that during her indoctrination, there was this sort of tactic of self-criticism that came with it. And so when you mentioned this walk of privilege, in my mind, I'm thinking about this self-criticism. Yes, I somehow have.
Okay, yeah, this is where I'm done. So to sum up this last part before I get off, she sounds like she hasn't seen the privilege walk. She should definitely watch them. She should, especially if she wants to. She believes that she doesn't believe. I might have to go. I don't want to misrepresent her if that's what I'm doing, but that privilege isn't drawn along racial lines. That's very clear in the privilege walks. So and it doesn't sound like she's watched them. It sounds like she's just hearing about it. She should really go watch those I don't know what they would be called. Those demonstrations. And then there's a very tenuous relationship she's trying to draw between self-scrutiny or scrutiny of, let's even say, immutable characteristics and communism. I'm going to let her finish because maybe she has something additional to say. But right now, there is no relationship. There's nothing central to communism that has to do with self-scrutiny. That also just seems like something you do when you're a decent human being, is that you think about what your flaws are and try to change those flaws. But let's hear what else she has to say.
Privilege over you because of my skin color. What do you have to say about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look.
I want to hear what she said. Hold on.
One of the conversations that I had with someone that grew up during the Cultural Revolution, she said that during her indoctrination, there was this sort of tactic of self-criticism that came with it. And so when you...
Yeah, and so like it's like, okay, so if someone was indoctrinated in communism, and one of the tactics that they use, so her claim is that CBT. I've been thinking about other stuff throughout the day, but CRT CRT is being used to usher in communism. Her evidence is that she has a friend, we're already off to a bad start, anecdotal, who says that they were indoctrinated into communist ideologies, and one of the tactics they used to indoctrinate them was self-scrutiny. And this is like, so then what we want to do in terms of like checking this and really thinking about whether or not this follows is just to use a different example. So if I wanted to say that people were being indoctrinated into or I could say something like, actually I could do it this way. I could say CRT is being used to usher in Christian beliefs. Why? Well, because I had a Christian friend one time who said that while they were being indoctrinated, they were told to scrutinize themselves, which is very common in Christianity. So therefore, CRT is being, there's no connection here.
You mentioned this walk of privilege. In my mind, I'm thinking about this self-criticism. Yes, I somehow have.
And like you can even see like why she sees some relationship here. This is obviously because of what she wants to be true in her own biases, because there is no actual connection here when you think about it. But she sees this and she's like, oh, that sounds exactly, we as humans, we want to make connections. And she has just made a connection. And that's all she can really see at this point.
Privilege over you because of my skin color. What do you have to say about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look, I think self-criticism is an important part of a good life.
Yeah,
and I think everyone can agree there. Excessive self-criticism, right? The kind of struggle sessions that you see in Maoist China, not good, right? Not something we want. But the point of, in my opinion, right, obviously some people don't do this well, and they do focus on individuals rather than systems, and they do focus on guilting people in a way that I think is inappropriate as someone who believes very deeply in the problem of moral luck, right? My feeling is we can talk to ourselves and each other and other people about privilege and understand that that's not a judgment against that person. It's not making you a bad person to say that you were lucky enough to be born with certain advantages, just like it's not making you a better or worse person to say you were born with certain disadvantages, right? The reality is people face lots of different kinds of challenges. And what I think is these kinds of approaches should engender what Christian was talking about in terms of epistemic humility and general humility with regard to your own successes and compassion with regard to the failures or the lack of successes of others.
And
yeah. So we're going to end it there. Again, this is just my time to do stuff like this. And yeah, I mean, that was a perfect example of, so I've watched this video and now I am in some way more confident about my position that CRT is some type of robust theory that has been formulated through good reasoning by people who understand reasoning, and my guess would be, if I had to put money on it, that it deserves whatever amount of credibility to some degree. I wouldn't say exactly the amount of credibility that it's got, but to some degree it deserves the credibility it's gotten among academics and other experts. And this is because when I hear people who advocate on behalf of it talk or make arguments, they seem to, on average, understand arguments better than the people who are against it. That to me is a pretty strong indicator. Not a strong indicator. I would have to listen to a lot more stuff like this. This has happened a lot with things that I've done. I spend more time analyzing people's arguments than I do, what they look like or how I feel about what position they've taken. I want to know, how good are your arguments? And so far, I've seen several fallacies committed by the other three people, Carolyn, and then Gothic specifically, fallacies that are well known that you can name by name. And I haven't seen the other two make so much. Sam seems to understand them to some degree, and Aaron may understand them. And so I come out of this thinking like, every time I listen to people talk about an academic topic, and there are people who are against that idea in academia, and I listen to the actual academics talk about it, it seems like the academics actually understand how arguments work, how reasoning works, how logic works, and the other people don't. And so I come out of it as somebody who can't rifle through all of the literature. I come out thinking, if I had to put my money on it, my guess is that the idea is pretty good and pretty robust and tested. That doesn't mean that it's perfect. That doesn't mean it won't change. That doesn't mean that other academics won't come through and scrutinize it. But if you want to scrutinize ideas, you have to fundamentally understand how reason works. Like, you have to read books on it. Like, you have to, you have to take a class on logic. You have to know what modus ponens is, modus tollens. You have to understand the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning. You have to understand the difference between classical and modal logic. Like, you can't begin to really scrutinize things and make good arguments if you don't know. You can't scrutinize other people's arguments very well, and you can't make good arguments yourself unless you fundamentally understand what makes a good argument and what makes a bad argument. And it seems to me that three people here really haven't done that, and two people here, as members of academia, it's we learn it to some degree explicitly, to an even larger degree, unfortunately, implicitly, so they're not explicitly teaching us these things, but I think generally a lot of us get an interest in it and read books on it. Yeah, so those are my thoughts.